Okay, let's try that again. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank y'all so much for joining me tonight for the first webinar in the livestock series on equine pasture management tips. Before I get going with the presentation, I do want to show y'all a few resources just so you're aware. And this is going to be recorded, so you'll be able to refer back to this presentation tonight. Okay, so the first thing I want to show you is you will get a Google Drive link after tonight's webinar, and that's going to have all of your resources in it. So there's a lot of publications in there. The slides will be in there that I'm going to be referring to tonight. So that a way that you will have that. And then something new that I've been working on is I've been putting together videos. So our office has a YouTube channel, and there's several videos in there that I think you guys would find helpful. So one is on rotational grazing. I've got another one in there on how to take hay samples, and another one on fecal egg counting if anybody's interested in that. And then I've got one more resource I want to show you. If you haven't heard of the NC Horse blog, there are posts made weekly on Mondays. Extension agents are the writers along with specialists, and so each week features a new topic, and it's a really good collection of information. And on the side here, you can see it's been going on since I guess about 2011. The topics are just, it's a mile long. So anytime you need some good extension information that you can trust, this is a good place that we have a lot of our horse information stored. Okay. So let's go ahead and get started here. Hold on one second. I did want to introduce Rebecca. And can everybody hear me okay? The ones that have video on, can y'all nod your head if you can hear me? Okay. We do have Rebecca Bradley joining us tonight from Madison County. So, hey, Rebecca, I see you up there now. She is going to help kind of keep tabs on that chat window while I'm presenting. And I'm assuming, Rebecca, you're helping allow people in, and that'll be helpful for me.
Yes, I am.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. Okay, let's get started. All right. There we go. Okie dokie. All right, so this is kind of the stuff that we are going to go through tonight. We are going to go through, basic things like soil testing, fertilizing and liming those pastures, weed control, some things like checking fences that you might not think about, planting dates, and then there's going to be some management tips on grazing systems and using sacrifice lot or dry lot. So the very first thing to do with pasture management is soil testing. It's really hard to know where to start on your farm if you do not have a current soil sample. And by current, I mean doing this every 2 to 3 years. So you do not have to do it annually. The nutrient levels are not going to change that quick. So you just want to have a goal of doing it every 2 to 3 years so you can keep up with what's going on there. But you can do all the sowing of grass that you want to, but if the nutrients aren't available and the pH is not correct, you're going to waste a lot of money in seed. So everything's got to be correct with the soil first. So all the extension offices have the soil sampling boxes and forms. You can also get the forms online at the North Carolina Department of Agriculture website. That is who does this service. It's not done by extension. We just help implement it. And I will say before I forget, currently the routine sampling, which is what we do for pastures, is suspended during the COVID-19 stuff going on right now. So, you know, you can't send in soil samples right now. You'll have to refer back to older soil samples that you've taken within that past 2 to 3 years, or wait till that's lifted. Hopefully it'll be lifted here sooner than later and you can submit soil samples. How do you take soil samples? You're going to need a clean plastic bucket, and you're going to need a way to get into the ground. So you can use a trowel or a shovel, and some extension offices will loan out soil probes, which are really helpful. But you want to use 1 box per perimeter area. So if you have your pasture split up into 4 pastures, you would want to you know, if they're all in permanent fencing for those 4 pastures, you would want to do 1 box per each pasture. But if it's just temporary fence, stripping it up for, you know, strip grazing or rotational grazing, and some really small sections, just do 1 box for that entire perimeter area, the permanent fenced area, if that makes sense. And if it's more than like a 10, 15 acre area, I would definitely split that in half, because once you get to such a large size, it's hard to represent that entire area. But you want to go, I actually need to edit this, you want to go 4 to 6 inches deep, and you want to zigzag around and take as many subsamples as you can. So for example, on a 10-acre field, I would say somewhere around 10 to 15 subsamples. And you don't want to sample near like an area around the water tank or right at the base of a tree or something like that. That'll skew the results. So zigzag around, go 4 to 6 inches deep, put that in your plastic bucket. You're going to want to mix that all together, and then you're going to fill your sample box up to the red line. And this is for North Carolina. I don't know if anybody's joined us from out of state, but that's what we do here for North Carolina. And you'll fill out the form and fill out the box. And if the sample is wet, you want to lay it out on a paper towel and let it dry out before you put it in the box. And also on that form, there's a code. There's codes on the back for pastures. E is going to stand for establish, and M is going to stand for maintain. Just FYI, when you look at that form, it usually confuses people with what that means. But always talk to your extension agents. We're happy to help you complete that form. So once you mix it all together, send it off. It is free to do soil sampling in North Carolina, except December through March. It's $4 a sample that time of year, which is still not bad at all. And once you get your results back, then you can work on fertilizing and liming your pastures. The things that you're going to learn from these soil samples, you will learn your pH, you will learn your phosphorus and your potassium. Those are kind of the basic things that we look for a pasture. There are some other levels that we can look at depending on if there's issues and things like that. But those are the main levels we're looking for. It does not test for nitrogen. Nitrogen quickly leaches from the soil, so it gives you a baseline recommendation for nitrogen based on the forage that you select on the form. So that leads me to my next question. Do I need to fertilize or lime? That's going to all depend on those soil test results. That's why it's really important to do them every 2 to 3 years so that you know and you don't waste your money. The only thing that can be applied each growing season is nitrogen if it's needed. So this is kind of a catch-22, if you will. You got to ask yourself, do I need more grass or am I good? Do I have horses that are too fat and I'm already limiting the amount that they can graze? Am I mowing a lot? Things like that. If you need more grass, you can apply nitrogen during the growing season. And I usually say 50 pounds to the acre will equal about 1 ton of forage per acre. So for most pasture situations, you're not going to want to do more than 50 to 100 pounds of nitrogen per acre unless you are making hay and you're trying to get as much tonnage as possible. And again, like I said, sometimes less is more. You might not need to add nitrogen. And there is a certain amount of nitrogen that is in the soil or that gets fixated and is available. And so most of the time you're fine and you don't need to add anything. Lime, phosphorus, and potassium will be determined from that soil report, like I said. On the lime, so that's your pH. If you have a fescue-based pasture, we're looking for a 6 to a 6.5 on your pH. And I mean, that's for a lot of the forages here in North Carolina. Your phosphorus, they're going to give us index ranges. And so we'll know, do you have a low amount of phosphorus or do you have a very high amount of phosphorus? Same goes for potassium. And you need both of those for overall plant health. Let's see, hang on one second. Okay. And if y'all would, I meant to say this at the beginning, if you'll just hold your questions until the end, and I will do like a Q&A at the end. Okay, so do you have weed issues? And you know, this varies so much from just having a few weeds out in the pasture that there's something out of place, that there's something different, it's definitely not forage, to having a total weed takeover and you know you've got to do something but you don't know what to do. When weeds start displacing the grass, that becomes a big issue. So weeds, if there's more weeds than there is grass, you've got to do something. You either have to apply a herbicide and you've got to renovate that pasture. Or, I mean, there are ways to do it without herbicide, but herbicide definitely takes care of things very quickly if you want to renovate it in a quicker type manner. You can use certain annual forages to smother out weeds, and that's kind of another conversation. So just get up with your extension agent if you have questions about that. The biggest thing is to know what weeds are present. So what do you have out there? Do you have, henbin or dead nettle or chickweed, which is out there kind of right now? And those, in my opinion, are not really nasty weeds and they go away pretty quickly. Or do you have something like thistle? Dog fennel, big nasty weeds that can really actually cause some harm to those horses out there if they come in contact with them. Especially if you think about where eyes are located on a lot of our livestock, when they go down to graze, it can definitely scratch and irritate their eyes, which can be a problem. The reason you need to know what you have is that's how you figure out how to control it. So knowing what type of weed it is, knowing if it's an annual or perennial or biennial, knowing what season it's in, so you know when to back up and to control it. Because now if you do have chickweed or you have buttercup with the little yellow flowers blooming, now is not the time to control those weeds. It was actually a month or two back was the time to go out and control those weeds before they flowered, before they did their damage. Once they flower and go to seed, they're going to come back next year. So you've got to kind of backtrack. So I always say, keep a calendar, keep a notebook, write these things down, because you tend to forget or they get away from you. And, you're like, oh man, I forgot I have those buttercups. One thing that's interesting about buttercups is they actually start to germinate in the fall. They germinate in the fall all through the winter, and you can actually go out and spray them in like February, March timeframe and kill them out. And that way your grass that is there has a much earlier head start on coming up and is not competing for resources. Buttercups are actually some of the easiest weeds to take care of and to kill out, but they like a thin forage area. And so I'm sorry about that. They like a thin forage area such as a dry lot or sacrifice lot or a pasture that's been pretty hammered. So that's also the other part of this is, why do you have weeds? you know, is it in a sacrifice lot or is it in one of your main pastures that if you start doing rotational grazing and you did some overseeding and things like that, that you could turn that pasture around. So weeds tell us a lot. There's also weeds like broom sedge or broom straw that come up in the fall. They start out green and then they turn into like a golden tan kind of color. Those weeds indicate either a low pH and or a low phosphorus. So we've got some of these weeds that are indicator weeds that let us know something's not right with this pasture. And that's again where those soil samples take place. So weeds tell me a lot when I go out on farm visits. And a lot of extension agents, we can ID weeds out on farm visits. Through photos or videos or things like that. That's how I'm doing a lot of it now, working remotely. So yeah, know what weeds you have out there. If you don't know, just get in touch with your extension agent. So extension can also help you figure out if you want to spray a herbicide, what herbicide to spray, and tell you about the label, and that you should definitely always read the label to see if there's any kind of grazing restrictions or if it's a residual and you cannot compost the manure. That's one of the biggest things with having horses. A lot of folks, you know, want to compost that manure out of the stalls or out of the dry lot area. And if you use a residual herbicide, which some of those are some of the, in my opinion, some of the better pasture herbicides because they continue to kill over a longer period, and really get a handle on your weed issue, that does carry through the animal and it will carry into the manure. And so if that manure is going on a garden, for example, it's going to kill any broadleafs in that garden. So that can be an issue. And that's why it's really important to consult with somebody before you just go out and buy a herbicide that you think will kill whatever weeds you have. And always remember that the weeds do displace forage. So if they cannot eat it, we really don't want it. But just know you're not going to get rid of all the weeds. So having some weeds out there is okay. But when it gets to be, you know, 15 to 20% of your pasture, like say you throw a hula hoop out there to give you a visual, and within that hula hoop, 15 to 20% of that area is weeds, that's when you know you've got to do something because you are really losing out on what forage is available. Okay, there we go. Hold on. My computer locked up there for a second. So somebody is not muted. Please make sure that you are muted through this presentation so we don't hear your background noise, please. Okay, coming out of the winter time, it is really, really important, if you haven't already done so, walk your fences. Go check your fences. We really didn't have an icy, snowy winter here. In the Piedmont, there might have been definitely more bad weather in the mountains if you're from the mountains, but deer can be really, really hard on fences. So you want to go and check those fences, especially if you've got fencing running through the woods or places that you cannot easily see, and make sure everything's up to par. If you have an electric fence, make sure that you have a tester so that you know how hot is that fence, and make sure that those horses stay where they need to be. Really, there is no point in having an electric fence if you do not keep it hot, because it's a psychological barrier. It is not a physical barrier like a board fence or a woven wire fence. So unless you keep electricity on it, it is not going to keep animals in place for very long. So definitely invest in a fence tester and go walk those fences and make sure that everything checks out. That way you don't have a horse that gets injured or a horse that gets out and gets, you know, in the road or anything like that. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about seeding pastures. So you do not want to plant cool season pastures now. If there's any message I can drive home from this presentation, it's this one. If you have fescue-based pastures, which are cool season, you do not want to do any overseeding or any type of seeding or establishment now. The reason being, that plant is a perennial plant. Anytime that you are trying to establish a perennial, and it is a cool season, or any perennial for that matter, it takes a long time. Think about a marathon versus like a sprint race. Annual forages are sprint races. They get up and grow and they're ready to do their thing very fast. Perennials take a long time, 6 to 12 months before they get established. So with that being said, if you plant fescue right now, it's only a couple of months before we go into the hottest part of the year. That plant does not have enough root to be able to withstand our summer, get the water that it needs, and make it through to the fall. So it's best to plant, whether you're establishing or you're overseeding, which is just adding seed out to an already established pasture to thicken the forage stand. You want to do that in the fall here in North Carolina. So September to October, and sometimes you can go a little bit later than that, just depending on our weather. We want to make sure that we're in a good rainfall pattern. Seed needs good moisture to germinate, and that way it has the entire winter to work on growing roots. And in the spring you can do some light grazing, and then by the fall, which is a full year later, you'll be able to go back to your regular grazing on those plants, but they've got to mature and be able to withstand grazing. Okay, so overseeding is important when your pasture starts to thin out. One thing I do when I go out on farm visits is I walk around and just kind of look. I'm looking, of course, see what weeds are present, how the pastures are being grazed, how many animals are out there, and then, what is the forage? What does it look like that's out there? So is there a lot of it? Is it mature? Is it young? Is it stressed? And one thing that's pretty big is if you've got a lot of bare ground, or you've got a lot of weeds out there that are taking advantage of the bare ground, you need to go in and overseed. And if it's really bad, that's when you would do a total renovation. So broadcast versus drilling. Broadcasting can work in certain situations. You want to make sure that you scratch the surface of the soil open so that when the seed is broadcasted out, it has good seed to soil contact and that there's good moisture available. So you can do that with like a light drag. You can do a homemade drag, no problem, and kind of scratch the surface of the ground. So if you have tall, weeds or tall grass out there, you would want to either mow it short or you would want to graze it down short, and then you would scratch the surface open and broadcast that seed out. Drilling means that you would use a no-till drill, and it would actually kind of cut open the ground a little bit and drop the seed down, and it has a press wheel that presses the soil back over top of the seed. And a lot of our grass seed only needs to go like a quarter to a half an inch in the ground. So honestly, you should be able to see it on the ground even when you're doing like a no-till drill. And I will say, if you're in Alamance County, and I'll say it even broader, most of the counties have a no-till drill available either through their soil and water office, through their extension office, or through the maybe a cattleman's group or something like that. Most of them are available through the soil and water conservation districts. So Alamance County just got one a couple of years ago, and it's been amazing. You do have to have a decent sized tractor to be able to pull it and use it, but most of them have a big seed box, which is where your grass seed goes, and then a lot of them have a small seed box, which is where clover would go, or small seed. And it's wonderful. It puts the seed exactly where it needs to go, and it doesn't disturb any of the established plants that you actually have out in that pasture. I do have our planting guide in that resource folder, so you can see, depending on what forage you're interested in, when it needs to be planted based on the region that you live in North Carolina. If you're in the mountains, the Piedmont, or the coastal region. Okay, so let's talk about grazing, and how to do rotational grazing, or how to be effective with your grazing. You definitely need to have a plan. If your horses are just out all the time and there's no thought process going into how they graze, when they graze, what they're grazing, you need to take a step back and put some thought into it, because that's really how this all works. You have to think, you have to make a plan. And if you really want your pastures to be your number one feed source, you have to have some kind of management plan. So the first thing I'm going to say is, if you've got one pasture, no matter how big it is or how small it is, divide it in half and start doing rotational grazing. This is going to allow that grass to rest. When horses are out 24/7, they will go back and they will graze the same plant every 1 to 2 days. And for those of y'all that don't know, it takes a lot longer than that for a plant to regrow. It takes weeks for a plant to regrow. And what you're seeing on top is also what's going on down below the soil. So if the grass is 2 to 3 inches tall, the roots are 2 to 3 inches in length. So they really can't survive for very long. There's not enough food. The plant can't make enough food for itself and photosynthesize. So that's the name of the game, is to let the grass grow until it's ready to graze, and then allow it to rest and point the horses in the direction that they need to go graze. And horses especially are harsh grazers. They can go all the way down the ground. They can rip a plant up by its roots because of their teeth and the way that they graze. And they're also very selective. So they love the cake of the pasture, if you will. They'll find their favorite spots and they will just hammer those spots. And then your pasture becomes uneven and it matures in certain areas. And then it becomes, down to the dirt in other areas. Then you have weeds come in, and that's how all that works. When you do rotational grazing, you say, okay, guys, we're going to go graze this pasture today, and that's where you're going to be at. And the other side is going to be resting. And they learn really quick that they've got to be more efficient with their grazing, and they're not as picky, and they go out there and they uniformly graze. So stocking rate. If your horses are out 24/7, this can work if you're appropriately stocking. So you would need 2 to 3 acres per horse not to notice not to have major impacts on that land. And that's if the pasture's in good forage. If that pasture's full of weeds, then you might need 6 acres to sustain that horse. So that's 2 to 3 acres of good forage if the horse is out 24/7. If the horse is rotationally grazing and turned out, 8 to 12 hours per day, and you're working out of a dry lot or sacrifice lot area, 1 to 2 acres per horse works pretty well. And so as you can see, you can definitely increase your stocking rate based on how you're managing them out on that pasture. And that's where having a dry lot makes grazing and pasture management that much more flexible, and I definitely advocate for them. For fescue-based pastures, which is what I'm mainly speaking off of for this particular presentation, you want to start grazing when the grass is 6 to 8 inches in height, and you want to stop at 3 to 4 inches in height. So that takes you going out into the pasture with a yardstick and measuring different spots in that pasture and kind of taking a representative sample and figuring out, where's your pasture at? Is it ready to graze? Is it ready for you to stop grazing? And so if we happen to go into a drought, this is where, again, a dry lot comes into play. You get those horses off that pasture, leave 3 to 4 inches out there, if not more, and do not graze until we start getting rainfall back on that pasture. So it definitely, you've got to watch, the growing season and what's going on out there and manage those horses accordingly. So this is kind of what it looks like for horse farms. So as you can see, this is kind of what I was talking about. You have one big pasture, so you divide it down the middle. And I personally like rotational grazing systems because you move the animals. You don't have to move fencing. You can use temporary fencing to strip up the pasture until you either want to put in permanent fencing down the road, or you can change your mind a lot if you have temporary fencing until you're ready. But it works so well because you just move the animals, you don't have to deal with the fence. But you want to have a common area that they go back to, and that just makes things really, really easy. And so this would be the shelter, and then this is the entrance gate where you would come in, and this is probably like a water trough or something like that. But you would have, where you could feed them in here, where their minerals are, water, and everything like that. And you just open the gate as to which pasture they need to go to. And if you don't have this common area, the issue can be water, and it can be shelter and things like that. And each of these paddocks, if you don't have, trees or things like that, and you've got to build sheds in every single paddock or a shared shed or something like that, it can get quite expensive. And then not everybody's equipped to have water in every single pasture. So that's why this common area is just really, really helpful to have. This is one that's more of an intensive grazing system, and intensive just means that you're putting them down on a much smaller strip, and you're really, really wanting things super uniformed. And it is a little bit more intensive. The issue with this is group dynamics or herd dynamics, if you will. If you've got one horse, then that's fine. But if you've got 3 or 4 that you're grazing, and if one picks on the other one, you want to make sure they've got enough room to get away from each other. So that can be something that's different with horses than it is with doing some of these grazing techniques with cattle. This one just shows a 3-way rotational system. And then this one shows kind of like a pinwheel system where everything's in the middle and then the pastures kind of shoot off from that. So that works really well. Okay, so this is a picture that was taken by one of our equine specialists at NC State, Dr. Paul Siciliano. If those of you that know him or have gone to any of his classes, he is phenomenal with all this. And I love this picture. This is a great picture. So you can easily see the ungrazed grass back here. It's very tall, very thick. You can see where the horses are grazing. It's definitely down shorter. And then you can start to see that regrowth, which is really important. So you see a 2-week regrowth and the 3-week. So you can see on this particular setup that 3 weeks, I mean, this stuff is probably ready to graze. And they still got another paddock to go. So by the time they finish that, this is definitely ready to graze and you start back over again. And that's how it works in the growing season. I mean, it's pretty much rocking and rolling pretty quickly on that regrowth if you give it dedicated rest. A lot of people ask me, how long can I leave them on a pasture? How long does it take before I go back to the first paddock? It is going to vary greatly on your stocking rate and the size of that particular paddock. So it's up to you to make sure that you're watching the grass height. It could be a couple of days. It could be a couple of weeks. It just all depends. If you've got one horse out there, 5, and if it's, a 1/4 of an acre to a 5-acre rotation. So it's just going to depend. These are just some more pictures showing you can definitely do this with one strand of temporary fence. You can use the tape, which is a little bit more visible, and you just want to make sure it's hot so that they respect it. But it's really easy to split up a pasture and start implementing that. Okay, so I've kind of already talked about all this. I didn't realize where this was in my slide set, I guess. But again, you want to make sure the grass is 6 to 8 inches tall before you start grazing. With horses coming out of the winter time, you want to make sure, because they're coming off of a dry hay diet mainly, and you don't want to upset their system right off the bat. So you can start easing them out onto pastures in 15-minute daily increments. You can go more if you know your horse. That's to be on the safe side. When the time on the pasture reaches 5 hours a day, you can give them unlimited access. But you just want to prevent any kind of digestive upsets on those horses. Horses that are, out on pasture 24/7, they're a little bit more accustomed to pasture and fresh grass than horses that are stalled or that are rotated in, on and off grass, or totally put on hay on the winter, depending on your particular situation. Okay, so again, you want to avoid overgrazing, and that just means taking it down to the dirt, going below that 3 to 4 inches. And I'll also say in that 3 to 4 inches is going to be all of your parasites. So when you start grazing, allowing them to graze really low, they're picking up more internal parasite eggs at that point, because those parasite eggs cannot really climb those tall grass blades. They kind of hang out down there in the bottom. Avoid that 24/7 grazing with no rotation if you can, unless you have one horse on 10 acres. There's few and far between, but there are those type of situations where that animal's not having an impact because of the stocking rate and the size of that pasture. Give that grass time to recoup and generate new growth. The grass will get weak and it will die if it does not get rest. That's what happens. It dies out and just can't survive that particular situation. And then weeds come in. Weeds are nature's Band-Aid. Okay, so my favorite topic. I love talking about dry lots. This is a high traffic area. So this is usually where water, minerals, hay, feeding, shelter, all that is. So whether or not you have a dry lot, you probably have a dry lot because they hang out in those areas. You want to have a dedicated dry lot, preferably with footing. So I'm going to show y'all some pictures here in a minute that are really good examples of dry lots. But you want to use these when the weather is not favorable for forage growth. So in the winter, this is a big one. In the fall to early winter, when our grass slows down and stops growing, again, referring back to fescue, when it gets to be 3 to 4 inches in height, say November, December timeframe, the horses need to come off. They need to come off of that pasture because horses don't understand if I keep grazing in the month of December and January that this grass is not going to regrow. And then you're just delaying your spring turnout if you hammer it into the ground. So you want to have either a sacrifice or a dry lot area. Sacrifice is usually a little bit bigger area, and it could be a couple acres and you just don't care what happens to it. So it's usually weeds and dirt and whatnot, but it's a little bit bigger area. A dry lot is a dedicated space, usually with footing, that is totally dry, so no grass, no weeds or anything like that in it. So yeah, get them off in the winter time unless you are planting a winter annual for grazing that you can rotate out on. The summer, so if your pastures are fescue and you don't have any kind of warm season grasses to rotate on, that it's going to go through a summer slump unless you've got some volunteer species that fill in and you see some grass growing out there. You might have to supplement and feed hay in the summer and pull them off that pasture. Drought, or if it's too wet, horses are notorious for ripping across the pasture when it's really wet because they've been cooped up for a while or something like that. They will just tear up a pasture in a hurry. So be careful with that. I would keep them off until it's dried up so they don't tear it up. You can confine horses during the day or night so they do not have 24/7 access. This is really important if you are managing horses with metabolic issues. They're overweight, they're prone to founder, things like that. So other uses would be keeping pregnant mares off of fescue. So if you are fescue based and you are breeding, we know those two things do not go together. And so if you've got a true dry lot, you can keep that pregnant mare off of the fescue and you can feed her orchard grass or feed her a different type of grass in the meantime. But if you're not breeding horses, then fescue is definitely the best bang for your buck here in the Piedmont and in the mountain regions of North Carolina. Okay. This is probably one of my most favorite dry lots I have been working with the owner on here in Alamance County. She has done just a phenomenal job. This particular farm is a boarding training type of facility, and they have a lot of horses. They have a lot of horses that they're managing. They do a good job of rotational grazing, and they group their horses according to their maintenance. Are they easy keepers or are they hard keepers, things like that. And you can see that without proper footing, things go to pot pretty quickly. And that's the top photo. And that was actually with a little bit of footing, not a lot, but just due to the way the water was draining and the runoff and where the horses were constantly going to the bathroom, it was pretty problematic. So what she did is she actually went in and added mats under the drip line for the edge of that shelter, and actually put some slotted mats out beyond that and covered with like a crush and run or rock dust to help stabilize it. And you don't have to do mats. Mats are kind of an added thing. And she's got mats up underneath her shelter just to keep the ground even, easy to clean up and pick up manure. You definitely don't have to. But having that footing, which you can see out here, is just crucial to keeping us a dry lot. And after the winter that we had, I actually went and visited this particular farm a couple months ago, and it still looked exactly like this. So she redid all of this last year, I believe. Yeah, last year it was all finished and completed. But it is a true dry lot and one that was really, really well done. You want at least, if you're going to do anything on a true dry lot, you at least want 6 inches of rock dust or crush and run, whatever you want to call it, these screenings out here. And you want 1% or so grade. You want to make sure that the property is graded, or the area is graded, so that you don't have issues with drainage. That's really important to making this very successful. If you want to take it a step above, you would do a layering system. So you would start with a geotextile fabric. Some people have heard it called cow carpet, things like that. It's like a black fabric. You start with that first, and you do about 4 to 6 inches of a medium drainage stone, and then you finish with 4 to 6 inches. I recommend 6 inches of that crush and run product. That gives you a very stable base that will not move on you, and will drain really, really well. So I have a good handout on that all of y'all will get with all the details about dry lots. This is another one that was done in Alamance County that I am itching to go out and see in person. The horse owner sent me this photo, and as soon as all this stuff is over and I can go out on farm visits, I'm going to go see this one in person. But they do rotational grazing off of this dry lot. This is another one that was really well done. And it is good to point out fencing. So depending on your, horses and your situation, you want to have really good fencing in a dry lot. It's usually some type of board fencing or a physical barrier type of fencing. Okay, this is one that is another farm here in Alamance County. This is the Therapeutic Riding Center that we have in Mebane. They do a phenomenal job with rotational grazing and grouping their horses and their little dry lot area. They are continuously working on footing. They've been using the Chapel Hill gravel, which I will say, let me go back. This one right here, she used the Chapel Hill gravel in underneath the shelter. She did say that in her experience, it doesn't stabilize and do as well outside as the crush and run, and that's kind of what I've always heard as well. So just as a side note. But they are working on their footing here as they can afford to do that. But this is another good one just to show you that they can rotationally graze off of. It's kind of almost like a pinwheel and how theirs works. And they've got, I think, all the geldings grouped together and the mares grouped together and things like that to easily work with them. And because their horses are really laid back, they just have tape, electric tape surrounding their dry lot area. No problems there. Again, you know your horses and know your situation. So, okay, with that being said, what kind of questions do we have? Now we'll try to get the chat box back up here. Let's see. I might have to stop sharing to get the chat box to come up. Okay, here we go. All right, so it looks like Kelly had a question about when do you add these different nutrients to the pastures? How long do you rotate horses away from it? So that's a really good question. You can put out lime at any time except when things are really, really dry or really, really wet. So lime can go out anytime we have decent soil moisture, because that's not going to affect anything. It's just going to work on raising the pH. As far as like nitrogen and phosphorus and potassium, you want to apply those during the growing season. So for fescue, you can do a spring and or fall application. You can do a split application, but you don't want to put that out in the summertime because fescue is not really grown in the summer. And what you're going to do is feed all your summer weeds that could possibly be out in your pasture. So timing is more critical based on the forage that you have with your fertilizer. So a lot of fescue pastures have already received fertilizer by this time in the growing season, because you want to get it kind of right on the front end so that it's able to take it up and use it for that growing season. And rotating horses away. Okay, so here is my rule of thumb. If you have lime or fertilizer applied to your pasture, you want to make sure that a good rain event comes by and washes it off of the surface of the leaf and down into the ground. And then you can start grazing again. A lot of times, this can be a week to 2 weeks or something from when it's applied. So a good rain event normally gets it off of the surface to where they would graze and pick it up. Okay. Okay, so Rebecca was adding into the chat box. You can come on if you wanna talk and elaborate about what you put in there.
Sorry, we've got kids here too, so we may be a little bit loud. So we see in Madison County, a lot of people know that they can afford, let's say, I don't know, $500 to amend their soil. So what they will do, instead of fixing one section at a time with that budget, they will instead sprinkle that $500 all over their 50-acre pasture, which kind of like a drop in the bucket versus watering one whole potted plant, if that makes sense. So that's the attempt, and we see that in a lot of times is, you're kind of throwing your money away when you do that.
Yeah, so I will definitely agree with that. What I always say is if you need quite a bit of fertilizer or quite a bit of lime to get your pasture up to par, just start. You can split apply it over that year. So say you need 500 pounds of whatever ratio it is, and you're like, I can't do that all in one chunk. You can split apply and do half of it in the spring and then half of it in the fall on that particular pasture. And the other way to go about it is pick a pasture that you want to start renovating or, adding nutrients to or increasing the pH on. And once you've gotten that pasture going, then go to the next one. So you definitely have to work with what you can afford, but you want to apply that rate or split apply. That's the only other option that you can do for that year is split apply. But yeah, definitely don't take, if it's calling for 500 pounds per acre, don't just sprinkle a little bit out there, because that's definitely not going to do anything. Okay, so any other questions? Please type them in the chat box. Okay, so Kelly says, what would you recommend for a pasture area that cannot be rotated with significant thinned out and dirt areas currently due to the resource setup with the water and shelter? Our pasture is not compatible with splitting. So at that point, your pasture, okay, all right. I'd say the biggest thing with that situation is you want to keep some kind of ground cover to reduce runoff or issues like that. Even if you cannot use that pasture as your feed source for grazing, it's, deemed your kind of exercise area, which is what that probably is if it's taken down like that. You want to plant something that can handle high traffic, such as like Bermuda grass, and Bermuda grass does go dormant in the wintertime and does turn brown, but it still kind of has a thatch out there. So working to figure out what kind of a forage can handle heavy foot traffic and still cover the ground, you might want to look towards Bermuda grass versus a bunch type grass like fescue. But you've got to switch your mode of thinking to, I need to make sure this ground's covered so that I don't have manure running off or things like that. The first order of business is being good stewards of the land as much as we can. Does that answer your question?
Too, what some people do for us, Lauren and Kelly, is they will lane to the certain spaces. So they will lane off with electric fencing I don't know how your place is set up, but if it is that way, they will lane with electric fencing, portable electric fencing. So that way their grass gets rest, but animals also have access to those spaces.
Yeah, and again, a dry lot would be your best friend in that situation, especially if you cannot really split up your pasture. Having a dedicated dry lot area that you can keep the horses on, you can supplement them with hay and stuff during the day, and then make sure that you're keeping good ground cover out in the pasture and just giving them a little bit of turnout and exercise time. That could potentially be good for you. Okay, any other questions? Okay, so we have a question about how could I rotate the places where cows graze? What would be a recommendation? My suggestion, if you are, oh, I did skip a question. I'll come back to you, Jamie. Just hang on one second. I apologize for that. But if you're grazing multiple species and you're not grazing them together, the animals that go first are the animals with the highest nutrient requirements. So let's just say you have lactating brood cows that have calves on them versus, you know, maintenance horses that are easy keepers. You would put the cows through first. Don't let them go all the way down to 3 to 4 inches, but maybe stop them, you know, at like 5 inches or something like that, and put them through first, and then you could rotate the horses behind them. So that's kind of one way that you can do it, is just kind of a leader follow type system with the animals that need to have the highest nutrition requirements first. And if you have different species, they do act as vacuums for each other's parasites. So it's pretty cool. Parasites are species specific internal parasites. So the cows will pick up stuff that affects the horses, and horses will pick up stuff that affects the cows. And also cows are going to graze differently from horses. So they are pretty compatible when rotating around to graze that pasture a little bit more uniformly. Okay, so Jamie said, you said sometimes a pasture needs a total renovation due to weeds. How would you go about that? So renovation is going to involve a total overhaul. So this can be where you would kill off that entire pasture and you would start from ground zero, which is dirt. The other way of going about it would be you can plow it up. You can go that route. Which I don't really recommend because it usually brings up a whole lot of weed seed when you do that, and can cause other issues. The other way you can is by planting annuals, like tall annuals, like millet, for example, to smother out weeds. And following behind that, you could do a replanting and renovate from there. So there's a couple ways to go about that. I would just consult with your extension agent and get a farm visit and get a plan in place, because it really just depends on that particular situation and what you're willing to do and that sort of thing, what you're capable of doing. Okay, any other questions? If you haven't already, please fill out the poll. So we're going to take a look at that real quick while anybody thinks of other questions. So I want to know, how did you hear about this webinar? Just trying to figure out my reach and where people are learning about the webinar series. Do you have a current soil sample results for your pasture? So the majority of you that have completed this, well, about half, say yes. The other half says no, we're never taken soil samples before. So definitely get on that as soon as all the restrictions are lifted, because that is going to be your best friend. Great record keeping. Get in the habit of doing it every 2 to 3 years so you know what's going on. Because again, if your pH is like a 5, you have no phosphorus available or low levels, and you spend hundreds of dollars in seed, you know, renting a drill, getting your seed, all that time and diesel fuel, and that grass germinates or doesn't germinate and doesn't do anything, and all of a sudden it's dead again because it doesn't have any nutrients. The pH isn't making the nutrients available. You have then wasted time, money, resources, all that stuff. So it is just so crucial to get that done. If weeds are present in your pasture, how do you currently control them? So a lot of you are saying mowing. One thing I will say about mowing, please do not mow any shorter than 6 inches. If you're going out there mowing your pasture like your yard, you are just chopping that root system down. Remember, what you're seeing on top is what's going on down below the surface. So if you're mowing, your goal needs to be just mowing off the top of the seed heads. You know, if you've got more weeds than grass and you definitely want to mow it, you want to mow it down short to get your grass to come up, you can definitely do that. But if you have a lot of grass out there, don't mow any lower than 6 inches if you can help it. Okay, do you currently have a grazing system such as rotational grazing? Majority of y'all are saying no, so definitely look into doing that. Give it a try. Temporary fencing materials are pretty inexpensive. Some extension offices have equipment available for you to rent, not rent, borrow. Sorry about that. I know I have one in Alamance County. So if you want to try, using some temporary fencing materials before you go buy it, we do have these kits that are out throughout North Carolina in regions that you can try it, and we can help you implement that. So don't let that scare you. Majority of y'all do not have a dryer sacrifice lot on your farm. I highly recommend it. It's about the only way to go with horses on small acreage, or if you are dealing with a lot of horses. It's phenomenal. Okay, and everybody so far saying they enjoyed the course. Yay. Or not the course, the webinar. I'm getting tired at this point in the day. So that's awesome. Okay, let me look back in the chat box. Okay, last call for any questions before we end tonight's webinar. Now, we'll say after tonight, you guys will get, you'll get the recording to this video. I'll post it to YouTube and give you the link. You will get that resource folder with the slides in it. And you will also get an evaluation emailed to you that I would greatly appreciate you completing. It's online. It'll take you less than 5 minutes. And it definitely helps us justify these type of programs, and also has a spot on there if you've got topic suggestions. We'd be more than happy to incorporate that into future programming, whether it's in-person workshops once we're able to get back at it, or more webinars. So please let us know. All right, well, thank y'all so much. Have a great night, and be looking for an email from me. Thank you.